afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online session, Narratives of Dementia and Aging in the Time of COVID-19. This online seminar is organized by Raquel Medina and Sarah Falkes, who are the co-founders of the Dementia and Cultural Narrative Network. We have 5 speakers today: Michaela Schrage-Vru, Ma Rana, Steve Milton, Stephen Fay, and Margaret Goulet. And we are on a very tight schedule. First, the speakers will present what they have prepared for us. This will be followed by discussion amongst the speakers. And then finally, there is a discussion round in which the speakers will answer your questions. I would like to invite you to share your questions by using the chat function of Zoom. And Raquel Medina will curate your questions and forward them to me at the end of the session when we will start the discussion with the speakers that answer your questions. My name is Aagje Swinnen and I will be your host today. And I will now introduce our first speaker, who is Michaela Schrage-Vru. She is a lecturer in German at the National University of Ireland, Galway. She's a founding member of the Women and Aging Research Network and part of the GenderNet plus EraNet project on representations of masculinities and aging in contemporary European literatures and cinemas. Michaela, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for inviting me to this very important panel. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed ageist attitudes that are deeply ingrained in our society. From the outset of the pandemic, as soon as it became clear that older people were at higher risk of contracting the virus, 2 seemingly opposing views have emerged in public discourse. The first, horrendously, called for older people to sacrifice themselves for the larger public good, suggesting that COVID-19 might have economic benefits by, and this is a quote, disproportionately culling elderly dependents. This view, published in an opinion piece in The Telegraph, is a particularly vile version of the narrative of older people as a dispensable social and economic burden. A trope that soon also found its way onto Twitter with the despicable boomer remover hashtag and the repeatedly expressed persistent view that the virus kills only the old and the ill. In contrast, the second view highlighted the need to protect older people, shielding, or as the Irish government called it, cocooning the most vulnerable and society. While this well-intentioned approach was phrased in terms that compare favorably with some of the public discourses in the UK and the US, its underlying assumptions about older people are no less problematic. Both views are based on the assumption that people over a certain age, alternatively 65 or 70, are a homogeneous group characterized by vulnerability, frailty, and dependence. That they are incapable of making their own informed decisions, and that they are no longer an essential or productive part of social, professional, or public life. Both views then not only buy into the cultural decline narrative of aging, but suggest that people can be deprived of their rights to self-determination, autonomy, and agency based solely on their age. Valid and much needed criticism of such underlying assumptions has since been voiced by both the British and the Irish Society of Gerontology, both of which formulated statements rejecting specific measures based solely on chronological age, and stressing both the diversity of older people as well as their valuable contributions to social life and the workforce. People over 70 forced to cocoon in Ireland for several months, regardless of their individual health and constitution, have likewise started to make their voices heard. In a particularly outspoken letter published in the Irish Times on April 14th, when cocooning had been in place for only a couple of weeks, Dr. Patricia Barker describes the effects it has had on her, someone who's just 70 and has no health problems. She writes, "I feel that I have lost control of my own life. I feel that my civil liberties have been dented. I suddenly feel frail and elderly. I feel useless. I feel that I have been herded with a large group of people of varying characteristics, health, fitness, and resilience, simply by virtue of the single factor of chronology. As lockdown restrictions have eased in both the UK and in Ireland, the side effects of isolating older people for months have been disastrous, in that many older people suffer physical problems from lack of exercise and vitamin D deficiency, as well as psychological effects such as increased anxiety. It's been reported that many people who lived independent lives before the pandemic have become more frail and dependent as a result of it. These negative effects are even more pronounced for people living with dementia. As the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland has pointed out, dementia has been largely forgotten and invisible during COVID-19. We know that in Ireland, about 1% of the population, roughly 55,000 people, live with dementia, and that this number will likely more than double by 2050. We know that 72% of care home residents who have been hit hardest by the pandemic are dementia patients, and that up to 250 people with dementia have died from the virus in Ireland. But we see and hear few individual stories. If the media tends to reduce older people generally to an age category, as exemplified by tedious stock images of wrinkled hands, slippery feet, or other disembodied images signifying frailty, dementia patients are reduced to their disease, or they simply don't feature at all. I would therefore like to spend the remainder of my time by highlighting two recent examples of life writing about dementia, both of which speak to the need for more varied cultural representations and increased visibility of individual stories behind the statistics and the stock images. The Austrian writer Arno Geiger's book, The Old King in His Exile, is about his father, and Irish writer Ian Mullaney's more recent book, Minor Monuments, is about his grandfather. Both acknowledge and unflinchingly explore the cruelty of the disease and its effect on both the person living with dementia and their carers. At the same time, the authors insist on the unchanging personhood of the dementia patient despite and beyond the disease. Arno Geiger uses exile as a metaphor for the dementia patient's continual sense of displacement, and he describes his own realization that he needs to meet his father on his own terms. Quote, "He has no world beyond his dementia. As my father can no longer cross the bridge into my world, I have to go over to his," end quote. Singing, he further explains, quote, "is emotional, a home outside the tangible world." And he describes how his father is calmed down and momentarily happy when they are singing classic folk songs together, even though his father no longer recognizes his son. Likewise, Ian Mullaney records both the everyday challenges facing the family in terms of care work and emotional strain, as his grandfather John Joe increasingly forgets his family members, friends, and his own identity. And yet, despite the sense of decline and inevitability described, scenes in which John Joe sings along to the radio gesture towards the personal and cultural archive of emotion that perseveres. Quote, "He sang old songs, the songs all old people know. He had forgotten most of everything, but scraps of melody remained. They were hidden in that part of the brain where treasures are kept, alongside the name of his wife, Kathleen." End quote. In highlighting such, Mullaney writes against the notion that a person suffering from Alzheimer's is, quote, "a person who has no value at all." By focusing on the person and their life story, both authors avoid reducing their beloved family member to a disease, focusing instead on their personhood and dignity and stressing the need for person-centered care in particular. Lumping together all people of a certain age group, one that incidentally spans roughly 3 decades, as frail, vulnerable, and dependent is clearly a form of ageism. Yet so is the notion that the lives of cognitively impaired older people, for instance those living with dementia, and in particular need of care and protection in the current crisis, might be in any way less varied, valuable, or meaningful. To counterbalance the ageism exposed by the pandemic, we need more individual and person-centered stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. So for all the participants that just joined, we ask you to write your questions in the chat section of Zoom, and we will curate them and save them for later. So thank you, Michaela, and I move on to Maurana, who is an artist and a doctoral research student based in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Birkbeck College at the University of London. She's conducting a study investigating the lived experience of participatory craft interventions in home-based dementia care. Ma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Sarah and Raquel for inviting me to present today. So to begin, I'll introduce my current PhD and how the focus of my research was shaped by my own experiences of being a dementia carer, which included using creativity in the home as a psychosocial intervention to provide cognitive stimulation, reduce social isolation, and increase well-being. And I'll also touch on that while the COVID-19 pandemic led to initiatives worldwide delivering home-based creativity interventions to thousands of people during lockdown to counter the impact of reduced cognitive stimulation and social isolation, there are still some people living with dementia and experiencing extreme disruption to their routine who are excluded. So as mentioned, I'm currently a doctoral student at Birkbeck College, based in the Department of Psychological Sciences. And the driver for starting the PhD was a short 5-minute film I made with my mother in 2016 called One Day When We Were Young. And there will be a link shared in the chat to the film on Vimeo. The film presents an alternative narrative of care, where care is reciprocal and liberating, which contrasts a mainstream filmic representation of care as burden and loss. The film also presents crafting as an expression of the agentic self, as well as a therapeutic intervention. My PhD is a qualitative study using interpretive phenomenological analysis to elicit a nuanced understanding of the lived experience of crafting together. The participants are adult daughter dementia carers and their mothers who have a dementia diagnosis. The craft activities are domestic textile processes such as knitting, sewing, and embroidery. So whilst there are published studies evaluating the health and well-being benefits of crafting with others in community-based environments like day centres, crafting together as a home-based intervention within dementia care has rarely been studied. And focusing attention on a home-based intervention was a personal interest to me, because while there are amazing community-based activities designed specifically for people living with dementia and their carers, for example, dance classes at London's Royal Opera House or clay workshops in a local community hub, pre-COVID-19, there had been a largely unaddressed inequality of access for people who could not leave or venture far from their home without one-to-one support. So the methodology of my study included me as a researcher visiting mother and daughter dyads in their own homes and videoing them while they crafted together. Each dyad nominated their craft activity, and selection criteria for the activity included that it was a craft that they had existing skill in, and perhaps they might have crafted on their own, but not normally with each other. And then a week or so later, after the crafting together activity had taken place, I'd interview each daughter on her own about the experience of crafting with her mother. And during the interview, each daughter was invited to comment on the replay or the video footage taken of them crafting with their mother. From my own experience and interviewing the daughters, crafting together is when we make and communicate together in socialized spaces. And I would suggest that we are, explicitly as well as implicitly, engaged in acts of care when we craft together. And this is in direct contrast to the neoliberal model of care that commoditizes care in terms of profit and loss accountability, that forces or legitimizes governmental health and social care providers to be careless and even dismissive of individuals as agentic or expert in their own expertise. So as I touched upon, the research topic of my PhD came about from reflecting on my own lived experience of being a dementia carer. Looking back at the first years of being a carer of my mother, she was diagnosed in 2014 at the age of 82. There came a point when I started to accept that I wasn't coping as well as I had imagined I would. I had unintentionally fallen into a routine of prioritizing ADLs when I visited my mother. ADLs being activities of daily living, like completing chores around the house, managing her medication, her diet and personal care. My stress levels rose, I felt alone, and I was close to running on empty. But more importantly, I was treating my mother as a passive recipient of care, which was not good. But I knew from my childhood that my mother used to be an excellent knitter and seamstress. So by introducing crafting together activities as part of our visit, I started to look beyond her body as a site of illness and instead refocused my attention to what was present and what could be uncovered. And in fact, when I watched her knit and sew, I was watching her as an able and resilient person and not as a passive object of medical inquiry. And through crafting, my mother could also experience herself as a repository of skill, an archive of knowledge and history, and the capacity of doing meaningful work. And importantly for her, these crafting together moments were a form of social interaction that were not dependent on reminiscence conversation, which was something that my mother struggled with. And the value of these crafting moments came from being in the here and now through expressions of creativity and the self. And earlier I briefly touched on the issue of equality of access. And it's taken a national experience of lockdown to shine a light on issues of access, isolation, and social vulnerability for harder to reach groups, and a national crisis for local government, health and third sector partnerships to repurpose their existing models of delivering creativity activities and interventions so they can reach people at home. And last week, the Culture, Health and Wellbeing Alliance published How Creativity and Culture is Supporting Shielding and Vulnerable People at Home During COVID-19. And this is a report based on 45 organisations with programmes reaching 100,000 people across England and Wales. And people living with dementia were listed as one of the groups receiving greater support. But even though the net has been cast wide, I still fear that a significant number of people were excluded, including those who were at risk of reduced cognitive stimulation, isolation, and emotional upheaval as a result of disrupted routines. And I think a link to the report will also appear in the chat. So returning to the PhD, the initial analysis of the interviews with the daughter suggests that while there are challenges involved in crafting together, these are outweighed by the benefits of reconnecting with skill, agency, and the sense of self, both for the person as a dementia carer, but the person living with dementia. And I wanted to finish by saying that crafting together at home is not a panacea for the challenges and demands of dementia care. And it is not immune to disruptions or unexpected revelations, but it can provide moments of mindful distraction and absorption and acts of process of crafting with another can create safe places in which feelings, beliefs, and experiences can be expressed and worked through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ma. We now move to our third speaker, who is Steve Milton. He is a director at Innovations in Dementia and involved in Dementia Diaries, which is a UK-wide project that brings together people's diverse experiences of living with dementia as a series of audio diaries that are carefully curated. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ashe. Yeah, so we've got, gosh, about 5,000 or so diaries recorded over the last 6 or 7 years, and 170 diaries specifically about coronavirus. that we've taken in since the beginning of the year. And I tried to do a bit of a thematic analysis about these and pull out what the key issues were. And I can't claim I've done it in any particularly rigorous or academic way. And I wanted just to present to you really a kind of a range of different voices from people with dementia involved in the project to give you a feel for the kind of experiences that participants are having. I should point out that one of the limitations that we have, of course, is most of the participants in dementia diaries tend to be people in the earlier to middle stages of dementia. So they're obviously not representative of people with more advanced dementia. And of course, we only work with people with dementia. So you won't be hearing the voices of carers here, accepting the fact that a number of our diarists are also carers for people with dementia, as well as being people with dementia themselves. So I'm just going to move on to my presentation now, which I want to use because I want to show you the people with dementia themselves rather than me. Okay, so we had a range of different issues that came up when I did the analysis, and obviously one of the really big ones for people is the loss of contact with close friends and family members. And originally we planned here to use audio recordings, but when we tried it last week, it sounded shocking. So I'm going to be reading what people have said. So this is Lorraine, and Lorraine has said, I really miss the contact with people desperately. As I was saying to Steve earlier, I miss hugging my children, my grandchildren, and giving them a kiss and coming in for coffee and the things that you really do take for granted that make your day. And at times I'm struggling with this. Now, each of these quotes I'm showing you here is representative of a significant number of other diary entries that touch on the same subject. So I've tried to choose ones which are as representative as possible. Another one around the issue of losing contact came up from Agnes. Agnes uses Alexa and Zoom a great deal, but this is probably 2/3 of the way through lockdown. Agnes said this. She said, Alexa, stop. Sorry. Said, I think I'm suffering from a lack of human touch. I have skin hunger. It's not a nice feeling. I long to feel someone's compassionate touch on my arm, on my shoulder, and that lovely hug. One really common concern that people had was that they were going to be losing the skills. Sorry, I just need to try and move on here.
Sorry, Steve, we cannot see anything. The screen is black.
Yeah, have you got that back now?
Yeah, it's black.
It's black. Okay, bear with me 1 second. Right. Okay. I'll tell you what. In order to save time, I'm just gonna continue to read, if that's okay, rather than me wasting time trying to get that screen back. So a lot of people talked about losing the skills that had enabled them to develop resilience since their diagnosis. And Glenda said, "I'm missing my social life very much, and I'm worried. Will I be able to cope with people when all this is over? Will I be able to go on stage and talk and do the things that I usually do? I'm finding my speech is getting difficult because I'm not speaking much to other people, and I'm missing my family very much." So we had a range of different emotional expressions during this period. And obviously one of the major ones, especially at the beginning, was anxiety. And we're starting to see, as we move out of lockdown, a new kind of anxiety emerging from people who don't want to lose the bubble of their lockdown. I'll come on to that a little bit later. Anger has been another strong emotion, specifically anger towards the government. And this is what Melvin had to say. Melvin said, "I've just had tears in my eyes because of how older people have been treated in care homes, and the older people to have coronavirus in hospital and to be sent to care homes. How horrendous is that? 22,000 older people have died in care homes. People with dementia have been written off. I've got no confidence in this government at all. I've got tears running down my face now. I feel absolutely devastated for the people and families who have had loved ones die. The sense of dislocation was felt very strongly by people. And here again is Agnes, who said, "What's wrong with my world today? I woke up this morning and I didn't recognize anything. Yeah, I know a chair and all those object things. In my world, it's all different. All my strategies that don't work anymore. This pandemic has played havoc with my world, with me, Agnes. Where am I? What's my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing? There's no structure anymore, no structure that's tangible, that is normal. It's like doing a jigsaw without a picture. Dementia didn't do this to me because I fought it and had resilience to bounce back, but this is just being isolated. I don't know what is going to happen to me now. I really don't know." Aside from that, we've also seen a lot of humour come through lockdown. A lot of people have engaged in, for example, especially poetry. And listen to this poem from Gail, which also talks of a lot of the concern we're now seeing from people who don't want to leave lockdown. Gail said, "I love my little lockdown bubble. I don't want it to end. I know it's driving some folk right around the bend. I love the peace and quiet, everything's so still. I wonder if it's quiet way over in Brazil. I love the calm, the tranquil place that my world's become. I'm liking all this calmness, it's definitely not humdrum. I wonder when my bubble bursts if I'm able to cope, or will it send me hurtling down the slippery slope? I love my little bubble, it's my new best friend, but I need to face reality. My bubble's going to end." And I just want to finish on a message, I think, for all of us as we move out of lockdown. And this message comes from Wendy. Wendy said, "Many of us have been well equipped, people with dementia, because we've already gone through this pandemic of chaos. The difference is you will come out of it normally and normality will resume. We will continue to live in it with our dementia, and ours won't go away. We've been living and continually adapting to a new norm since our diagnosis. As our dementia throws more challenges, we stumble until we hopefully find a way of adapting, of outmaneuvering a new challenge. And just the same as before, if today is a bad day, then tomorrow may be better, coping one day at a time." Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. We now move to our fourth speaker, Stephen Fay, who is a lecturer in Spanish at the University of Aston. His research investigates cultural narratives of dementia-related diseases in Latin America at the intersection of cultural studies and the medical humanities. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ahe, for the introduction. Thanks very much, of course, to Raquel and Sarah for organizing this seminar. I was having some trouble with the microphone, but I'll hold it up right here and hope everyone can hear. I'm going to talk to you today about, as Ahe says, I'm going to talk to you about a study that I'm leading at the moment into the potential impact of two narrative-based creative expression programs on the quality of life, psychological well-being and personhood of people with dementia, mild cognitive impairment and care partners in Medellin in Colombia, and the adaptations that we've been forced to implement in this research in response to the COVID-19 crisis. First question, what on earth takes a Birmingham boy all the way to Medellin? The city, maybe some of you know, is actually an international hub of dementia research, but of the pharmacological kind. The Antioquia region, which Medellin is the regional capital of, is home to 25 extended families, 5,000 people in total, with the ill fortune of having the world's highest incidence of hereditary early onset Alzheimer's. And this is caused in the Medellin, in the Antioquia case, by a genetic mutation. It's the E280A in the presenilin 1 gene, but it's known locally as the mutación paisa. And people with this mutation typically show signs of cognitive decline by their late 40s. They begin to need significant support with daily life by their late 50s. And very sadly, they often don't live beyond their late 60s. That said, as you can imagine, this unusual genetic profile actually makes them extremely important for drug research, because clinicians can apply and evaluate preventive medicines before the neuronal damage caused by the disease has advanced to the point of no curative return. The family groups that we're working with in Medellin, for example, are at the center of this, of a very large, a $30 million, it's called the Alzheimer's Prevention Initiative Colombia study. They're looking at the efficacy of a drug called crenezumab, how effective it is in slowing down the buildup of amyloid beta plaques, and the preliminary results expected in February 2020. Pero bueno, as we'd say in Spanish, what about narrativa, or where on earth is the narrative in all this? Well, the story is that I was actually in my preferred partner country, Colombia, banging my head against a bureaucratic brick wall, which is often the case in Cuba. And somebody sent me a book called 12 Characters in Search of a Psychiatrist, which is basically like pseudo-diagnostic studies of famous characters in Colombian literature. The book had a chapter by a clinical neurologist called Francisco Lopera, diagnosing early onset Alzheimer's, in the main character of a novel called En la Laguna Más Profunda. Turns out that Lopera is the PI of the API Colombia drug trial that I was talking to you about. And to cut a very long story short, he's now the co-PI on our pilot Dementia Narratives project over there in Medellin. As I said, ours is a mixed method study of the impact of two narrative-based creative expression programs on quality of life, psychological well-being, and personhood. And the programs consist of two methodologies. The first is an oral storytelling series of workshops using the time slips method devised by Ann Basting of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, that I certainly know some of you are familiar with. And the second is a series of written storytelling workshops devised by me using the microfiction narrative genre. So nanofiction is really of just a few sentences. We're facilitating the programs with 4 different groups of participants. We're using time slips with a group of 8 people with this mutación paisa, so the genetic mutation that Lopera is studying. We're using the same with 8 people with sporadic later onset dementia. And then we're using the microfiction program with 8 people with mild cognitive impairment, and then 8 care partners. Pre-COVID-19, the project was going extremely well. Lots of enthusiasm from the participants, lots of enthusiasm as well from my Colombian colleagues who weren't really familiar with this kind of intervention at all. Some of this enthusiasm is writ large in the stories themselves, and I've got some old school visual aids here. There's the first one. So in the very first time slip session, I think you can see that okay. In the very first time slip session, and time slips use visual stimuli like this one, and one of the participants clapped her eyes on this visual stimulus and immediately broke into spontaneous song, which was Esperando el bus, basically means waiting for the bus. Her rendition was actually much more tuneful than mine. And in the second microfiction session, we asked the participants to send each other a copy of this postcard. It's of a London bus, and asked them to come up with an imaginative account of this fictional, fantastical journey to London. One decided that this bus was haunted by people who'd suffered sudden deaths, and her role, the purpose of her trip, was to convince them to resign themselves to these deaths and move on. So you can see there was an immediate and very energetic, enthusiastic interaction with some of these methods. Sadly, along came the virus and sat down beside us. And on the 17th of March in Colombia, the government imposed a fairly strict quarantine for the whole population. In mid-June, these measures were extended for vulnerable populations until the end of August. And basically it is quarantine. People are allowed out, certainly people in vulnerable populations are allowed out for 1 hour 3 times a week. Most people expect the measures for these vulnerable populations to be extended for another couple of months beyond the summer. The impact on our sessions, face-to-face sessions, as you can imagine, they were immediately cancelled. After some pulling of hair and gnashing our teeth, we have now embraced the power of Zoom and made our peace with WhatsApp. And I'll finish just by telling you a little bit about our results so far, including some of the obstacles we've come up against and some of the solutions we've come up with, just in case they're useful for other groups doing similar stuff out there. In the TimeSlips workshops, so 2 groups of 8 people, we shifted quite quickly to online sessions. Problem, we started with Skype. There were lots of connectivity issues. Obviously, this is a two-way cooperation. The facilitators are participants in Medellin, and then me over here. I'm actually in London, not in Birmingham. So Skype was really difficult because of connectivity. It was also extremely difficult to control background noise. Solution, we switched to Zoom. It allows us to be much more dictatorial with the mute button. We're also fortunate that Lopera has been working with these families for 35 years, and very quickly the participants and their family members understood that this was something potentially important that we were asking them to take part in, and that's meant that they've been extremely constant in their attendance of our sessions. They always find a quiet corner, even the busiest of homes, and the family are always on hand to deal with any technical issues. Another problem, it was extremely hard to manage the online interactions between 8 very talkative, energetic TimeSlips authors. What we did is we subdivided the group of 8 into 2 groups of 4. It's meant definitely that there's a reduced level of socialization, interaction between the participants, but it's also meant we can really pay attention to the 4 people in every group, which, if you know TimeSlips, is actually one of the fundamental pillars of the methodology, the acknowledgement, even echoing of everyone's participations. Tomorrow we'll hold our 14th online session, and we've seen some really fascinating stories, some narratives, including some imaginative, even cathartic incorporation of the COVID-19 situation. So responding to this visual aid, that's not the right one. Responding to this visual aid, for example, one of the participants said, well, I don't want to go to this party today because the government simply banned us from going out. We can get infected. In my imagination, I'd really like to go there and get stuck in. I'd dance with them and share the moment. So even online, still a very high level of energy and engagement with this methodology. The microfiction workshops, what we did, we switched immediately to WhatsApp-based interaction with the participants, and we also set up a YouTube channel to give the instructions for independent narrative activities. To be honest, this program, this method has been much more challenging, primarily because, unlike in TimeSlips, the original design was pedagogic and iterative. In other words, we'd intended for the participants to have gradual interaction, gradual practice with the stylistic and structural characteristics of this genre, building only slowly towards the production of their own microfictions. So whereas our conversational exchanges with them have remained very fluent, their actual production of written microfictions, or even written anything, has been much more staccato. Some of them as well have very low literacy levels. What we did is we quickly set aside any intention to carry on with the pre-established program, and we switched to much more accessible activities, narrative-based activities. One was a game called Consequences, where you write a woman's name, a man, and you fold the paper over as you go. You might know it. A woman's name folded over, a man's name folded over, where they met. She said to her, he said to him, which produces the most hilarious and surreal stories. We also did listographies, what makes people happy, what makes people sad, what they change about the world. And one that I really liked is called El Mundo desde mi ventana, or the world from my window. So we just asked people to take a picture of their world, what they were seeing from quarantine, and then either write a fantastical story or just write a postcard telling us about what they can see outside their windows. Again, some really rich, fascinating contributions, including other reflections on COVID-19. In one of the World from My Window postcards, a protagonist said, I wanted to take this photo in the daytime to show you this quarantine has had bad effects and good effects. For years, we haven't been able to see the mountains at the other side of the valley. Medellin is in quite a steep valley because of the pollution. But now the cars have stopped, we can see just what a beautiful city this is. That said, unlike in in the very faithful 13-week time slips participation, here the contributions have really fallen away to such a degree that we're actually going to bring this part of our project to a close. That said, we're pretty positive about the next step, which is we're going to make a transition to Twitter as the obvious, optimal platform really for exposure to and subsequent production and sharing, dissemination of microfictions. We're lucky that we're being supported by Twitter's Latin American Public Policy Division. They're going to, first of all, help us augment the data literacy of our participants, and then ultimately next year work with us to produce best practice guidelines for the use of Twitter as a psychosocial resource for people with dementia, MCI, and their families. Very quickly, the future of this project is we're actually applying for some more Global Challenges Research Fund support to transform these immediate, urgent, adaptive responses to COVID-19 into a longer 6-month feasibility and effectiveness study of the online provision of creative expression programs for people with dementia and their families in Colombia. You can imagine this remote provision, as other speakers have commented on, as Mar was saying, the remote provision is actually really important everywhere, but in Colombia and, to be honest, in Latin America, access to this kind of post-diagnostic psychosocial service is extremely patchy outside major cities. You can imagine our aim is just to build up an evidence base for the extension of this kind of program to the group that I'm working with has 17,000 people on their database, and then to other Colombian communities affected by dementia, and ultimately across some of the south-south borders in the continent into other Spanish-speaking countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. We now go to Margaret Morganworth-Goulet, who is our 5th speaker. She's affiliated with the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University and a prominent age critic and theorist. Her contributions to the field of cultural studies of age include prize-winning books, the latest of which is Ending Ageism, or How Not to Shoot Old People. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, this has been fascinating, and what you're going to watch next, now for something completely different, is part of a novel in emails exchanged by 2 old friends in their 70s, Rose and Paloma, who have known each other since middle school. They started to write more intimately when Paloma's husband was diagnosed with a moderate cognitive impairment. The text, which claims to be documentary nonfiction, is actually a research-based epistolary novel. I depended for much of my material on age critics like those in this webinar and people who are attending. And thank you, those of you I know who are attending, all of you actually. This novel is an homage to all of you who interview and who share best practices. As women friends around my age, in their 70s, started caring for husbands with various impairments, I realized that even in the age of Alzheimer's, the wife's story, as Rose calls it, goes untold. Who is listening amid the evasions and the fears of these lugubrious times? Caregivers need a literary form in which they hear not one, but at least 2 voices. My epigram comes from Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Prize winner, who made interviewing many people thematically a recognized history genre and a literary form. In The Unwomanly Face of War, she reflected, sometimes coming back from such interviews, it seems to me that suffering is a special kind of knowledge. As I started sharing this special kind of knowledge in my novel, I had the great good fortune that a major local actress, a colleague of mine, Annette Miller, loved the material. And she thought it would make a great play on Zoom, and she found another celebrated actor, Adrian Kostansky, to play Rose. So this gave me a chance to hear my characters. Ahye told me last summer that the task for me as a writer would be to differentiate the voices. Well, she was right. So the dialogue between Rose and Paloma starts in 2016, and I think it's going to end this spring with COVID-19. Rose's second husband is named Jonathan, often called Jay. Paloma's husband is named Carl. Rose is a realtor who now stages houses for sale. Paloma is a retired philosophy professor. And you see me playing director for a few seconds. Disregard that. The brief section we show is an argument between the two friends about how to tell Paloma's daughter, Lydia, what is wrong with her father and whether to use the word dementia. Rose tells Paloma she shouldn't tell anyone about Carl's diagnosis or use the word dementia. So I will retreat now behind my characters if they can summon up the video.
Nursing reminds us to go on treating all humans as, quote, persons, unquote. I will certainly look at it when I have time. I go back to feelings, deciding what to say, how to say, when to say it. Dementia, context matters for this judgment. Lying to Lydia is not in me. I forced myself to give it some thought, who had laid out the scenario and made a plausible psychological case for her easing into the facts by herself. But she's already anxious and suspicious. I don't feel I can wait. I think I've waited long enough, in fact. As for
Jay is Jonathan, the husband.
Sorry, I didn't see it. As for Jay, you are not engaged in constantly rectifying, searching for his keys every day, cleaning up the messes he forgot, finding the lost bills or cash in weird places. I have to say, Jay sounds normal. Don't you worry too much. Sufficient unto the day. I'm so sorry about Hillary. You worked so hard in New Hampshire. I understand that people are stunned and anxious, but, well, I can't focus much on any of that.
Nice.
Okay. Maybe I'm wrong about Lydia. Maybe she'll grow up fast. At 40 plus, she should. You will know how to talk to her. I am willing to call her. Just give me a signal. Jay now. Jay hasn't put his keys in the fridge, but he loses. Okay. I looked in the fridge. I asked, where's the butter? Do you know where the butter is? Don't know. He had put the butter in the pantry. I found it by accident. Do you remember in the Sarah Polley's film, Away from Her, the first sign after the wife got lost in the woods is a pan around her kitchen showing someone put signs on objects. Stove, refrigerator, her husband, I guess. Then Jay burned a pot while he was busy texting. I have done this too, normal aging, I say when it's about me.
You slow down my decision about telling or not telling. And so it occurred to me, surprisingly late, that it's up to Carl to tell her, or to tell me whether he wants me to tell her. This is an ethical issue. Bioethics is my field. I'm amazed that involving Carl was not the first solution on my mind. I'm not happy about this discovery. I feel I did him a wrong in my mind. I'm not quite sure what went wrong.
Don't beat yourself up for not involving Carl off the bat. I know what you are thinking. You think you were treating him in your mind as if already he wasn't there, but more likely you put Lydia first for a moment because she's your kid, because you are her mother, a kind of mother-daughter privilege, or because she showed her feelings to you first and not to her father. Does this make sense? I say this as your comrade and her godmother.
Oh, Rosie. Dear Rosie. Thank you for giving me options for thinking about how I was seeing Carl in relation to Lydia. A protective maternal feeling put her first in my thoughts. Perhaps. Well, it was the result of never having had to consciously put Carl first, because he was always immensely, unavoidably, unconsciously significant. This may be opaque. It needs to be thought through more. Still, I need to be careful about keeping him mentally in my embrace. As ever, I want to be careful, even if it takes more consciousness. I don't want to fall into a bad habit of negligence. That would not be so difficult from the doctor slighting your mother. But of course.
Good. That's where it ends.
Okay, thank you very much, Margaret. And thank you, Raquel, for solving the technical issues. I'm glad we were able to listen to the actors. Okay, so now we have approximately 17 minutes left. So first I would like to ask our speakers if they have questions for each other. Stephen.
Hiya, yeah, I had a question for Ma, and she said that, I think I understood that she said that in choosing the participants in the craft-based study, you picked people that had some prior experience with crafts, but not necessarily or possibly absolutely didn't have experience in doing crafts together. And I just wondered why you made that a criteria or had that in your mind. And then secondly, if the participants themselves kind of voiced any reflections about the novelty of that interaction.
I think one of the reasons why I was interested in, I think it came from my own experience of being with my mother in crafting, because I recognized that I sometimes crafted on my own and she could craft on her own, not so much in recent years, but it was a way of kind of coming together and being with each other, but not as a dementia, a carer and the person being cared for, but coming together on an equal sort of platform of just kind of being people taking part in the creative activity. One of the reasons why I kind of chose because of the methodology of IPA, you have to kind of have quite tight sort of criteria for your participants. So I decided that participants would already have skill in the chosen craft, because I was interested to see how much of that skill was still there. And from speaking to a lot of the daughters from the interviews, they had assumed, particularly with some of them, that as soon as they'd heard the dementia diagnosis, it was like, that's it, we're getting rid of all the wool. It's no point kind of, they're never going to be able to do that again. And I think with most of the daughters, when they came together and crafted together, they kind of saw their mother in a different light. And again, not being the sort of recipient of care, but a person who had skill, often a higher level skill than the daughters. I mean, my mother's embroidery was amazing. I mean, better than the skill I have now. And that was the case with the other daughters. I think they were taken, I wasn't assuming that it would happen, but for some of them, they were just amazed at the skill that their mother still had, and why wouldn't they? And so it was also just reconnecting, using crafting to reconnect with the person that you're looking after and recognizing that they are able, they have skill, they have knowledge, they can still teach you things. So it's a way of kind of drawing out a different type of relationship and shifting the balance from, being cared for and doing the caring to something that was more equal. or potentially to kind of be more equal.
Fascinating. Thanks very much.
Margaret, I think you also posed a question to the other speakers. Or is it another? Could you unmute your mic? I still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now, yeah.
Margaret.
In relation to the nursing home deaths, this is a question actually for everybody, but Michaela's raised it. Nursing home deaths in the United States, the opening of premature opening of schools and businesses and so forth. Could we use the word genocide? Would this be an appropriate time to use that word? I mean, I like to use equal rights. I like to use equal right to life. I like to use human rights language, but I think it's time to use really hard words like genocide.
Michaela, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, I think it would probably be a good time to use that. I think we should use drastic words because the things that are going on and that the pandemic have revealed and exposed are really drastic in the sense of, especially also if you read the more unofficial discourse online, for instance, where people say, well, those are just older people and who cares? And I really think that using drastic words for something drastic going on, that care home inhabitants, for instance, are not protected in the way they should be, not looked after in the way they should be, that money is not going where it should go, namely in caring for these people. Definitely, I would definitely adopt this term and think that it is quite appropriate. That's my view on this.
Thank you.
So maybe I can smuggle in a question from one of the audience members, Michaela, for you as well. It's a rather long one, but I will read it exactly as it is in the chat. It says, Michaela, your talk was fascinating, and that is such a striking point about the two competing cultural narratives or discourses. I agree that the family members are coming from a very different place in terms of their personal engagement with known and dear individuals. But I noticed that they still say things like, the only world he has is dementia, and he knows the songs all old people know, which also tend to homogenize older people and people with dementia to some extent, and which we might have a different reaction to if they were said by, for example, journalists. And so here comes the question. So do you think these are really entirely different discourses, or do the families themselves also get drawn into prevailing cultural narratives?
That's a really good question. Definitely a good question. I would say you have to differentiate. With Arno Geiger's novel, The Old King in His Exile, it's a very nuanced depiction, and it really shows the learning process also of the son coming to terms with his father's dementia. And the way he all of a sudden has this realization, I have to meet my father on his terms. Basically means, I mean, I had to keep it short, so I couldn't elaborate on this. But what it basically means is that he says, I won't correct him all the time. I won't tell him, like, if he says something that seems to be out of place, I won't correct him, and I won't tell him, you know, I'm actually your son and not your brother or whatever. But I'll just meet him on his terms, and I'll just play along. Because it makes him feel more comfortable if I do so. But with some of the other texts that I've read, and especially the more recent Irish text by Ian Mullaney, I did grapple with a few of the things said in there, and I sometimes felt that there were a few statements that seemed to be generalizing and homogenizing, but were then again counterbalanced by other moments in the text. Like, for instance, when he says, all old people know this song. Of course, that is kind of a cliche as well. But on the other hand, the focus on the emotional connection established in this particular case kind of for this. I was actually at first thinking about bringing in a third text from Sinead Gleason's recent essay collection Constellations, which is about her aunt, or as she calls it, second mother, suffering from dementia. And then I decided against it because there were a few sentences in there that really bothered me. Like when, for instance, she said that she would rather die than losing her mind and similar things. And I really found it hard to find anything positive in the description, anything kind of, to work with, and how to make life more bearable, both for the carers and for the dementia or people with dementia. And so, I think that obviously family members and also writers writing about these topics are also very much entangled with and influenced by these discourses and the terms, the ageist kind of assumptions that we probably have all internalized to some extent. So yes.
Thank you, Michaela. There are also quite some questions for you, Ma, that follow on Stephen's question. The first one is whether you think that crafting has a role in care of people who never crafted before.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I think there's this kind of assumption that if you have dementia, you can't learn new skills or you can't make new memories. And that is absolutely not the case from my experience of being with my mother. So it could be about learning, using craft to learn new skills or to readapt skills that you have, to attempt to transfer skills to taking on a new craft. So yes, I mean, it could be learning a new craft, absolutely. And I think there's the thing about kind of challenges and problem solving, which I think is about, kind of getting that cognitive stimulation. And, if something goes wrong or that's not a problem, you learn through it. But I think it's also about kind of handling materials and touch and color. So it's not just about kind of skills that you remember, it's about the process as well, and passing on knowledge with other people. So it's a conversation that you could have whether you're doing it with other people or doing it on your own.
Thank you. There is another question, Ma, that I think is also very interesting. I will read it from the chat. So the crafting among mothers and daughters sounds lovely, but I wonder how you would respond to those who would say it further genders carecraft as feminine and family responsibility. Would your research be just as relevant for men and for paid carers, or is there something special about family here?
No, it could be relevant. I mean, for my study, because I was using IPA and it's very strict in its methodology that you have to use homogeneous group, maybe only up to sort of 10 participants, I had to restrict it for the methodology. But there were potential participants who were sons, who were fathers, who were wives looking after husbands. So the restriction was put on me rather than me kind of seeing the restriction there. But also that there is the aspect that women do hold a majority status in the stats. More women have a diagnosis of dementia. More women are dementia carers. But I think it's interesting to think about working with paid carers, because for me, I would be interested in exploring that, because just from personal experience, when my mum was having paid carers, their job, it seemed only to be concerned with kind of getting her sort of washed, clean, sort of practical activities, but not many of them had skills in outside of those kind of practical caring activities. And actually what would have been useful was for somebody to kind of be with her and do something creative, which would have been just as important, as well as kind of, making sure that you get dressed or, or your hair's washed. I mean, I'd rather my mum not have her hair combed, but, did something creative. She would have felt better for that, I'm sure.
Thank you, Mom. Then there is also a question for all the speakers. I read from the chat. As someone working with care home residents with advanced and very advanced dementia, I wonder what ways do the presenters envision for engaging people in these stages? It seems that during this pandemic, they have been left out, although they were the hardest hit. For instance, what non-digital ways of engaging can we imagine? Thank you. Anyone? Steve, yes? Please unmute your mic. We still can't hear you, Steve?
The host muted me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, please.
Okay. Oh, great. I'm back on now. We make. Sorry, I've got two puppies in the room. We've got a network of 100 or so groups of people with dementia called the Deep Network. And we're in the process of putting together a collection of stories from across coronavirus, about including how people have been connecting who don't have access to Zoom. Now, Zoom's been an enormous hit with people with dementia, but there are still plenty of people who aren't accessing it. So a lot of groups have been using Post. They've been doing sort of drive-by and walk-by hello, so communicating across garden fences. And we're always trying to find ways of keeping people involved, whether they're using technology or not. And we'd have to share those stories with you when we finish working on the document, which should be towards the end of this week.
Thank you, Steve.
May I?
Yes, Margaret.
I would. There's a wonderful story about a Baltimore nursing home that's run by Baptists that is all African Americans, old, in various conditions of health and whatnot. And they instantly had a lockdown, and they decided they were going to do various things to make life more pleasant. They beefed up their entertainment for everybody. They got a culinary expert, and they made the meals more interesting. And as soon as they could, they started porch visits. I mean, I think it's time for, in some cases, to go back to real life, real communication, real faces in real time. And the porch visits are perfectly safe for these old people. And I guess I should have said right at the beginning, they've lost nobody. They've had no illnesses. They did best practices early on. They've had no deaths. They are a model for every one of us, and every one of us should know you do not have to die of COVID just because you are old or have cognitive impairments or live in a nursing home. So.
Thank you, Margaret. There is also a question specifically addressed to you, Margaret. It's how to deal with difficulties in expressing suffering in the time of pandemic, especially in the case of dementia patients.
That's such a hard question, and I don't know that much about the later stages of cognitive impairment. I think storytelling is our default position as age critics, literary and cultural critics. We want to get stories from people if they can tell them, and we need to encourage them to tell them. I mean, I think, for example, I'll just hone in on ageism because that's my beat. Ageism for beginners is where I feel we all have to start and move on. I think we should be asking people, more people, some of you are already doing this, and some of it is coming through the Dementia Diaries, how they feel about being the victims of this cultural discourse that says, we cull them, you know, who cares about them? I mean, I am finding it very hard to get people without dementia to say that they are affected by this in any way. Now, what kind of denial? Is it denial, or is it that the cocoon is like the poem that about enjoying the bubble? Is everybody I know enjoying the bubble? Or are they simply not telling us the stories about it? So I would ask for storytelling and try to make it the question put in as intimate a setting as possible so that people can indeed tell their stories. I should have said that I have interviewed many of the women who are caring for their husbands. And I'm going to start doing it again and see what the changes have been during the COVID-19 era. And thanks for that question. I'll think about it a lot more.
Well, it's 5:15, which means that I have to close this session. There are still many interesting comments and questions in the chat. So I suggest that for those people with urgent questions left, you could contact the speakers directly. I'm sure that the speakers are willing to answer your questions. And I hope that this will just be the beginning maybe of this exchange. Thank you very much to the speakers for their presentations and participation today. Thank you for the organizers, for all the people who helped with the technicalities, and of course for everyone that I cannot see, but that I know were listening, and your presence here is very much appreciated. I wish you a wonderful summer. Bye.